Thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is James Myall. I am a policy analyst at the Maine Center for Economic Policy, and I am the lead author on MUSEP's State of Working Maine 2021 report that we're here to talk about today. I'm joined by a few other folks I'll introduce as we go along. The report, the State of Working Maine 2021, launched last Thursday. It's available on our website. We're here today with the aim of providing you with more insight and perspectives on the report to open up for some questions. You'll hear from Dave Cooper, who's from the Economic Policy Institute, who's the director of the Economic Analysis and Research Network, Representative Ryan Fecteau, the Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, and Suzy Young, who is with the Maine AFL-CIO's Unemployment Assistance group, one of the organizers of that group. We'll have time for questions at the end for the panelists and me, but feel free to put questions as they occur to you in the chat, and we'll pull them from there at the end. I think in terms of just setting the table and laying the scene for the report, some of the big themes in the State of Working Maine, it's our signature report that we do every year. And every year we take on sort of a different topic or a different aspect of Maine's workforce, especially for low-income workers. This year we focused on the experiences of workers in the pandemic and what COVID-19 meant for Maine workers. There are a few sort of top-line findings and themes in the report that shine through. One is the way that the experiences of frontline workers during the pandemic offer lessons to us. And so those are lessons many of those lessons that actually go beyond sort of just the immediate public health threat and talk about sort of the general undervaluing of work that we've seen, especially even that work that's during the pandemic, we called all of these folks heroes, deemed them critical and essential workers, but they were working in jobs that have long been undervalued. And that's something that we can change and learn from. And so, those changes can include things like increasing worker power in the workplace and public policies that increase conditions and set minimum standards across the board. I think the other thing that the report really highlights is sort of just how urgent it is for policymakers in Maine to address the needs of workers here, both to recognize kind of those individual hardships that were incurred, but also to make sure that there's a robust recovery as we come out of the pandemic, and that we can rebuild the economy in a way that is stronger and more inclusive. Obviously, this report also sort of COVID-19, and obviously it was not limited to Maine. The report also speaks to the way in which these local trends tie into national ones. In some ways, we saw sort of a better response in Maine than we saw in other states. And existing policies helped to set the table for that. So there were stronger minimum wage policies. We also reacted more nimbly in some areas. For example, passing reforms to the unemployment insurance system fairly quickly, and trying to continue some of the policies like universal free school lunches that were so successful during the pandemic. But we also know that there are places in the report where we highlight the need for continued federal action. And as I'm sure all of you know, kind of the continuing discussion in Washington about the Build Back Better bill really plays into that, and will help to address a lot of the things that are highlighted in the report as well. So to speak more kind of on that national perspective, I wanted to introduce Dave Cooper. He's going to talk to us a little bit about that. He's the director of the Economic Analysis and Research Network at the Economic Policy Institute, which is a national nonpartisan think tank. Over to you, Dave.
Thanks very much, James. So as James summarized, this report nicely lays out the principal challenges that workers in Maine faced over the past year and a half. And I can tell you that these challenges were not unique to Mainers. Workers throughout the country have been dealing with all of the same issues, which I'll go into in a bit more detail in a minute. But I want to first quickly reiterate 2 points that I think are really important to remember. Number one, many of these problems existed long before the pandemic, as James alluded to, and COVID simply brought them into sharp focus. Specifically, I'm thinking of poor job quality in many industries, large racial and gender disparities, both in job quality and access to jobs, and inadequate public supports for the jobless and others struggling to make ends meet. And two, the second point is that these challenges are ongoing. We are still in the midst of the pandemic, and policymakers still need to be responding with both public health and economic measures. So in the COVID-19 economy, there were essentially three groups of workers: those who lost their jobs and faced increased economic security, those who were classified as essential and faced increased health risks, and those who were able to continue working from the safety of their homes. It's important to note that Black, Latinx, Native American, and low-income workers generally are the least likely to have been in that third category, those able to work safely at home. And this is something that the report notes as well. Job losses last year were concentrated in industries that disproportionately employ workers of color, Black women and Hispanic women in particular. I'm thinking of industries like leisure and hospitality, state and local government, education, and health services. To quickly put some numbers on this, data from the Census Bureau's annual income and poverty report show that from 2019 to 2020, the number of full-time year-round workers fell by 13.7 million people, and over 80% of those losses occurred among people making less than $50,000 per year, more than half among people earning less than $35,000 a year. The number of full-time year-round earners who were white men declined by 9.2%, white women 9.9%. For Black men, the decline was 13%. For Black women, 13.1%. For Hispanic men, it was 16.3%. For Hispanic women, it was 17.4%. So huge racial and gender disparities. Unemployment rates spiked dramatically last April, with workers of color experiencing unemployment at significantly higher rates than their white counterparts, and that disparity continues today. The national jobs report that we got this past Friday showed that unemployment for white workers is down to 4%, but the unemployment rate for Black workers is 7.9%, Hispanic workers 5.9%. And importantly, these unemployment rates don't capture the full harm caused by the recession, as they don't count all the workers who have left the labor force, who have had their hours reduced. For example, if we simply added the 4.4 million workers who have left the labor force because of COVID, the unemployment rate today would be 7.9%, not the 4.6 that the official measure describes. Now, the State of Maine report also describes how workers of color were more likely to be exposed to COVID. This is certainly something we saw at the national level. Black and Hispanic workers are far less likely to be able to telework. Between May of 2020 and April of 2021, only 1 in 5 Black workers was able to telework. Fewer than 1 in 6 Hispanic workers could telework. That's compared with about 1 in 4 white workers. And for those that have had to go to in-person jobs, many, particularly low-wage workers, have no ability to take time off if they get sick. Nationally, about half of all low-wage private sector workers, so I'm referring to those workers who are in the bottom 25% of wage earners, about half of them have access to paid sick days. Among the very lowest wage earners, those in the bottom 10%, only a third can take time off when they get sick. And this is one area, as James noted, where Maine has made progress. The state's new paid sick days law that took effect this year is a huge step in the right direction. As the report points out, the law can still be improved. I think extending coverage to small employers would help target many of those lowest wage earners that typically are the least likely to have access to paid sick days. But the report describes all of these challenges in excellent detail. I'm going to close now by noting, by talking a little bit about the current state of the labor market, because I think there's a lot of ambiguity and seeming competing narratives about what we're hearing about the current state of the labor market. Nationally, we're down about 4.2 million jobs from where we were before the pandemic, but the real job shortfall is probably more in the range of 5.5 to 8 million jobs when you account for population growth over the past year and a half. At the same time, we're hearing a lot of stories about employers struggling to find staff, workers rejecting low-paying jobs, possible labor shortages in some sectors. And what I think is clear from all of the data and from these stories about the current labor market is that workers want jobs that pay a decent wage, that offer stability in hours and income. They want supports or flexibility to manage care responsibilities, and they want safety from the coronavirus and other public health threats. The policies that the State of Working Maine report recommends, things like raising the minimum wage, providing comprehensive paid sick and family leave, guaranteeing fair schedules, strengthening workplace protections and workers' rights to organize, providing childcare supports. These are all policies that go straight at the problems that both workers and employers are confronting in the labor market today. And I think that that's something that lawmakers in Maine and throughout the country should really take note of. And with that, I'll pass it back to James.
Great, thank you, David. And that's a good segue to our next speaker, Speaker of the House, Ryan Fecteau, who I think is going to talk a little about some of the implications of state level policy and some of the work that the legislature has been doing and will be doing in the upcoming session related to these issues. Speaker Fecteau.
Well, thank you, James, and thank you to MISEP and others for compiling this report and working on, capturing what's happening here in our state, and especially in the aftermath of the pandemic. I'm joining all of you today because working people in Maine face major challenges to sustaining their households and having stability in their lives. The work we've done and continue to do go hand in hand with addressing inequities and addressing the needs families have, making sure Mainers have access to childcare, paid leave when a family member is ill or after they welcome a newborn, and unemployment benefits when they need those benefits to get by, to build that bridge between one employment opportunity to the next. For Maine's economy to recover from COVID-19, workers must have the opportunity to return to a market that ensures they can provide for themselves and for their families. This can be achieved through laws that improve working conditions and programs that remove barriers to work. I want you to be aware of what we did as Maine lawmakers in the last year and what we're continuing to work on in the upcoming session and certainly for sessions to come, because the work is never over and we have to continue to make sure we improve the conditions for working people here in our state. So first and foremost, on paid family leave. Right now, thanks to Assistant Senate Majority Leader Matty Daughtry, a commission on paid family medical leave is meeting to develop the best possible paid family leave policy proposal for our state, for those of us here in Maine. I voted for LD 1338, a bill to improve and expand paid time off in Maine, which has been carried over. It would protect workers who need to use paid time off from retaliation from their employer. And we want to make sure that workers are able to utilize a law that we passed, and that employers are not retaliating against those workers for using what they've earned. And I think that's common sense, and that policy, LD 1338, will hopefully become law in the next session. For children, our work is about stabilizing Maine families. I work to expand preventative dental care for low-income adults this year. Though children already had these benefits, for some parents who never had access to dental care, like my parents didn't, you might not know about the importance of dental care for kids. And certainly you wouldn't have that natural connection to a doctor, to a dentist. And so by expanding coverage to adults, it's our hope that coverage will also, more kids will be interfacing with a dentist in the upcoming year as that law takes effect. At the bottom line is, we know that adding preventative dental care for Mainers of all ages will impact children's health and take a burden off families who could previously access dental care only if they were in an emergency, which is obviously one of the most inhumane ways to address dental health in the state. It was, and secondarily to the fact that it's inhumane, it was also incredibly costly. No Mainer should have to wait until their gums and their teeth have rotted beyond repair, that they have to go to an emergency room to get that care. That is simply wrong. I'm glad we fixed it. And now it's my hope that we can get more providers to accept Maine care coverage and to subsequently get children into their offices as well. Maine lawmakers were second, as James noted, in the nation rather, to fund free school meals. So Maine will cover what the federal USDA program doesn't, to ensure no Maine kid goes hungry. A really important provision, and a step forward, making sure that kids can go to school and not have to worry about whether or not they can afford to pay for the school lunch. Another really important item is childcare. I'm currently working on a bill to keep costs low for parents while supporting Maine's critical childcare workforce. We know families have really struggled with deciding to stay in the workforce or care for their young children, and they deserve support from the state. And the workers who are providing this care, providing early childhood education, they deserve our support as well, because those jobs are grossly underpaid for how significant they are to our families and to our workforce. We need to address both things, the affordability of childcare and early education, and support the workforce who is delivering that care, delivering that early childhood education by increasing their wages and making sure that this is a career ladder and not a job where you work a few years, perhaps it's a passion, and then you move on to another job that simply is paying more, leaving behind a job that is in your heart, that is the job that you care the most about. And those are the kinds of choices that folks in this industry are currently making because the wages just aren't there to support the work that they are doing every single day. At the federal level, it's important to note as well, the Build Back Better agenda includes a cap on childcare costs at 7% of family income. That would be a huge step forward. I've been working with early childhood educators in Maine to develop plans to recruit and retain this critical workforce behind our workforce. Sadly, wages have not kept up with the demand for a professional childcare workforce. Federal subsidies would help the childcare industry, and it would help families with kids make ends meet. Critically important, and that's why I've been a huge advocate for the Build Back Better agenda. We need to see that law pass. As it concerns employment and worker protections like unemployment insurance, after all the layoffs at the start of the pandemic, Maine's broken UI system was laid bare. We're fixing that, and we're providing Maine people with navigators who can help guide them through the complexities of the system to help them get the benefit that they deserve when they have experienced a layoff. When a Mainer has experienced a layoff, you do not need to face additional barriers to getting back on your feet while you look for a new job. Soon you'll hear from Suzy Young, who was a true saint, helping people navigate the complexities of the unemployment system. Her work as someone who voluntarily stepped up to do good, to help her neighbors, will be replicated using the new navigator provision and the law we passed this most recent session. As it relates to supporting unionization, this year we saw Maine Med nurses, the Portland Museum of Art employees, the Maine Democratic Party employees, and now folks at Bates College organizing and unionizing in their workplaces. Everyone should have the right to unionize. State leaders want to make sure employers are accountable and that we're always pushing for fairness for workers and that labor laws are followed, not skirted. In fact, at my own job outside the legislature, my colleagues and I unionized this year and are currently working on our first contract negotiation. All workers in the state of Maine should have the right to unionize, to come together in solidarity for a fair workplace, for a fair wage, for fair benefits, and fair workplace conditions. That is at least the least we can do for workers, is giving them that right to unionize in all sectors in the state of Maine. Last, as it concerns equity, Maine is one of 9 states who are going to use racial impact statements in lawmaking to ensure equity in how we look at a wide range of issues. I'm proudly serving on the subcommittee to develop the pilot project the legislature will use to test this out in 2021. Thanks to Assistant Majority Leader Rachel Talbot Ross for pushing an act to require the inclusion of racial impact statements in the legislative process, which we hope will lead to more equitable lawmaking going forward. These are just some of the ongoing efforts to support Maine families and workers at this juncture in the Maine legislature. This panel will be happy to answer questions about these efforts and more at the end of our remarks. Thank you for your time, and thanks for having me here today to talk about these really important issues. Thanks, James.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to pass it over to Suzy Young, who has been mentioned, has done a wonderful job, sort of, especially from a volunteer standpoint for so long, working on the Maine AFL-CIO's Unemployment Insurance Assistance Facebook page to talk about some of the sort of real life experience and the real the impact that the pandemic and had on ordinary people and that some of these changes will have. Thank you, Suzy.
Thank you for inviting me today. As a self-employed artist, I knew my business was in trouble when the COVID pandemic shut down most public gatherings. I watched all my shows and markets disappear off my calendar as the pandemic began to rage. I filed for unemployment on the first day of unemployment and was available to self-employed and gig workers May 1st, 2020. I had become the main breadwinner of my home as my husband had become disabled in July of 2019. I found the Maine AFL-CIO's online Facebook unemployment assistance group as I was looking for answers on how to apply for federal pandemic unemployment benefits. And it wasn't long before I became a volunteer moderator in the group, answering questions and working with the Maine Department of Labor to help people get their benefits. A lot of people posting on the page were desperate, and so many were having difficulties with filing or even understanding the questions. The morale of the group was heading in a very dark place, and I tried to become a positive voice in the group. I always have believed a half full cup is much better than a half empty cup. I tried to be the silver lining in a very dark cloud. I started posting often, and people on the site started reaching out to me. It is much easier to talk to someone who is in the same situation. It's a hard thing to understand if you haven't lived it. We dealt with so many desperate and frightened people, and a few nights I had to calm and comfort people, considering ending their lives. They were so despondent. I was proud to join House Speaker Ryan Fecteau to help pass legislation that will fix many of the problems in the state unemployment system. However, there are still many improvements that need to be made, especially at the federal level. Being part of this group and getting to know so many different Mainers of all ages and walks of life has really opened my eyes to the struggles so many have endured during the pandemic. For too long, voices in the media and online repeatedly claimed people on unemployment just didn't want to work. But since then, it's become an indisputable fact that these benefits have not prevented people from re-entering the workforce. The reality is that too many people face challenges in returning to work. Many older Mainers are hesitant to get public-facing jobs for fear of contracting COVID in the workplace. At the same time, I've talked to numerous older workers who can't even get a job interview after applying countless jobs because applications require them to fill in their graduation date. They suspect they are victims of age discrimination, and it is apparent they may very well be. Age discrimination is very real, and we need to make sure discrimination protections are enforced for our older workers, as well as people of color, immigrants, and other marginalized groups. I've talked to numerous women in our group who wanted to return to work, but do not have access to quality childcare or simply can't afford it. Most have had to deal with schools going back and forth with hybrid learning, which have required parents to miss work to care for their children. There have also been many COVID outbreaks at schools and childcare centers that required their children to quarantine. Now that the pandemic unemployment benefits expired months ago, these parents need a safety net for these emergencies more than ever. This pandemic has made it clear that we must invest in programs to support working parents. The ideas outlined in this report, including the implementation of a statewide paid family leave law, publicly subsidized childcare, and a fair work week law to ensure employers accommodate the schedules of working parents, are steps in the right direction. Finally, what has become very clear over the past year is that we don't have a labor crisis. We have a wage crisis. People want to work, but their wages need to keep up with the cost of living. Policymakers need to help Mainers recover from the pandemic and be able to sustain basic living needs. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Suzy. Thank you for all your work and for sharing those perspectives from those folks you helped. I think so. This is the portion of the event where we are open to questions from folks. We did get a handful of questions come in through email beforehand, but obviously, please, any of the reporters and folks attending, feel free to add your own questions for all of the panelists or for individuals in the chat as well. I think to start, one question that came through that I think could be interesting to kick off is, someone asked from the recommendations outlined in the report, what are maybe the most attainable, what are the most important policy steps, and sort of which are most attainable, which might be the most challenging. I can certainly start and then pass off to anyone else who might want to chime in. I think from my perspective, sort of a couple of things that stand out on either end of that spectrum. I think it's really important as we look to the federal work passing for the state to be in a position to implement some of those programs, especially as a lot of them are federal and state partnerships. And I think the subsidies for childcare and universal preschool are potentially transformative for a lot of parents and for kids over the longer term. But it will require sort of the state kicking into gear for contributing some cost sharing for those programs, but also in terms of just setting up the infrastructure and the quality childcare assessments and things like that. So I think that's one that's very in reach because of the federal funding, but does require conscious effort from lawmakers. And one that I think has potentially proved challenging in the past, but has a lot of, I think, the rationale for it has become more clear than ever, has become the need to sort of be able to reform scheduling practices through reforms that are often known as Fair Work Week laws. A number of states and cities have tackled this either universally in the labor market, or sometimes through certain sectors or for large businesses. And these are things like requiring businesses to give their workers more predictability in the kind of hours they're working, to compensate them sometimes for hours that they've missed. And I think that I think could go a long way towards, especially a lot of what we're seeing in the labor shortage right now. A lot of the industries that are having the hardest time hiring workers are those places in places like hospitality and tourism, where folks are asked to come in at the last minute on notice for shifts. They don't know how much money they're going to be making from week to week, and it's really hard for them to balance work with other things in their lives. So I think if we can tackle some of those scheduling issues, I think that could be a big difference for folks in people's lives as well. But I'd also be interested to hear from other folks on the panel what they think might be some of their top takeaways from the report.
So I can't speak to the political feasibility of any of these policies in Maine, but I can say that economically they are all possible. None of them are new. None of them are policies that haven't already been implemented either in other states, other cities, or other countries. And we have seen that all of them have beneficial impacts for workers, both through the improvements in job quality that they make and in reducing many of the racial and gender disparities that I noted earlier. They all tend to disproportionately help workers of color, women, and the most vulnerable in the workforce. So they're all doable, and they would all go a long way to solving some of the problems that we've articulated.
Great, thank you. I see Laurie has asked, will racial impact statements in the legislative process also include recommendations to lessen racial gaps? Would you like to take this one, Mr. Speaker, since you're working on that particularly?
Yeah, I think the work of the subcommittee right now related to LD2 and implementing the racial impact statements is just getting off the ground, if you will. We decided at our last meeting which committees will be part of this pilot. I feel like I'm being tested because now I have to remember which of the committees, but I believe we went with judiciary, education, and labor and housing, and 3 policy areas that are distinctly different, obviously, and I think will really give us the opportunity to see what we do have at our fingertips in terms of data and information that can go into constructing these racial impact statements, and then what we don't have, because I think that's going to be the key piece to these statements is discovering where we are lacking data, and perhaps we'll have to reassess and fill in those needs. But the pilot will be a huge first step to getting our footing on how this will work, and what part of the policy process is it most impactful to have these impact statements. So is it best to have them at the beginning when a bill is introduced? Is it better to have the impact statement drawn up when the bill is near completion? Because obviously, as we all know, the bill process goes through many iterations, and the bill as it's originally introduced might not be the same as a bill once it's near final vote in a committee. So I think we're going to be able to get a sense of what those things look like as we do this work through the pilot process. But generally speaking, I think the impact will be giving the legislature the knowledge. I mean, it's not going to be a single-handedly going to determine the outcome of legislation, but it would give the legislature a bit more information to base a decision off of when taking a vote in the committee and then ultimately on the House and Senate floor. It looks like we're going to be partnering with the University of Maine system and I believe the Cutler Institute to help in this process. So I think having that those researchers on our side of making this work happen, I think will be really important and critical. And I'm looking forward to seeing the first iteration, the first big step towards getting this implemented. I hope I answered the question.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, I think sort of like as one of my roles is sitting on I'm lucky enough to be a commissioner on the permanent commission on racial equity in Maine, and I know that members of the commission are excited to see this step. This is something that we all pushed for, and I think will be potentially could be a big change in the way that Maine looks at policy making. As the speaker said, sort of we'd be one of 9 states doing this, but Maine would be unusual in the fact that we'd be expanding the use of these impact statements beyond sort of traditional criminal justice areas as well, which I think is important too. I think we're sort of nearing the close, so I won't keep people too much longer. I think one question that was interesting that came in is someone had asked if we could expand a little bit on the fact that job losses are concentrated among workers with low income and women and people of color, and sort of talk about why that is. I can say I think that sort of there are a couple of things behind that. I think one particularly is that it's not a coincidence that a lot of women and people of color are concentrated in low wage work. A lot of that is sort of structural, and you can see if you look at the history of some of these professions, that women and people of color are both sort of encouraged and directed into lower paying jobs for sort of some historic discrimination means that they can't find work in other sectors. They're also, especially for women, there's sort of societal expectations in terms of where we expect women to work, and then those occupations are often paid less as a result. So there's sort of a circular thing that goes on there a little bit. And as we pointed out in the report, a lot of these occupations are underpaid with low benefits and irregular schedules even before the pandemic. And so those are all factors that also led to them being places where sort of exacerbated some of the high risk that these folks had from COVID, but then also made it more likely that people weren't willing to stay in those jobs when that higher risk was combined as well. So I think that's a big piece of that as well. I don't know if other folks have thoughts on sort of the most impacted sectors of the workforce and sort of why we especially see sort of women and people of color being particularly impacted.
Well, I'm not sure to what extent this is a relevant comment, but one thing I would just add or couple with your comments, James, is I recently had COVID and had the experience of isolating for the 10-day period. And fortunately, I have a job where I can do my work from home, and It didn't interrupt my schedule or my ability to continue to earn a paycheck. But just that one disruption in someone's life, a 10-day period where they're not, if they're making an hourly wage and you're out of work for 10 days and your employer does not have a policy in place for allowing you to still earn, even though you're not working because you're out doing your due diligence, keeping your community and your workplace safe. I mean, the impact that has on someone's life is substantial. And so when you see people exiting the workforce, I have to imagine that in some cases, this kind of disruption is significant. I wouldn't be surprised if there were cases where employers or employees decided to part ways because of a 10-day disruption like this. It is obviously unfortunate that this virus requires us to stay home this way, but it's also important. I mean, it's preventing the spread, the emphasis on keeping one's health safe. And I mean, it's also not necessarily the easiest thing to recover from. It it really does take a lot out of you for several days. And I'm very thankful that I didn't experience the worst of it, in part because of I think because I was vaccinated. But obviously that the impact this virus has on people is obviously significant. It's incredibly disruptive. And that's if you contract it. Now, I mean, if you could contract it, and then maybe on day 7 your child contracts it, and now you're out for another 10 days or whatever the case may be. So you can quickly see sort of how this unravels into a huge disruption to a working family, especially those who are earning a wage on an hourly basis and are really making it paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah, I think that's a really important perspective, and I think especially that disconnect between the amount of time that folks are asked to isolate for and the amount of time they have available to them, even if they have a few days of paid sick time, it often makes it very hard for them to isolate for the amount of time they're supposed to if they're in the frontline job. Greg asks, to what degree is housing and transportation a cause of the labor force shortage? I think I can speak a little to that, but I think others might have other things too. I think there definitely are folks for whom I think sort of transportation is an issue, and I think it's a little less in Maine than in some other states in some ways, because there are relatively few people, who don't actually own cars here. But I do know that one of the things that we see, and housing plays into this as well, is that sort of, especially for folks in more rural areas, sort of distance in getting to work can be a real barrier. And even if you have access to transportation, sometimes the cost of maintaining that transportation or the gas cost of getting to work makes it unrealistic to be able to take a job for a low wage worker. So that's definitely something that plays in. I don't know the extent to which it's sort of an underlying cause, but I certainly think for some folks it's a big issue. And as I say, I think we've seen for years in rural parts of Maine that increasingly as sort of the economic center of the state shifts further south, which is something we've been seeing. That provides a big problem for folks in those areas who then find themselves potentially facing longer commutes or having to relocate to more expensive parts of the state. So that's kind of a couple of my 2 cents there. I don't know if other folks have thoughts on housing and transportation.
I don't have, I haven't looked at any data that would help answer that question, but I will say that a lot of the dynamics that the speaker just mentioned play a role in these disruptions, because we know that low-income folks generally and people of color specifically are more likely to be in multi-generational households. So all of the dynamics that the speaker just mentioned about one person being sick leading to the rest of the household becoming sick are far more pronounced for those folks. And so those housing situations where people don't have space to quarantine has been a significant problem throughout the pandemic. And it's really magnified in these particular communities where those sorts of living arrangements are more common. And for those workers, the need for flexibility and the ability to take time off to provide care to a sick family member are more pronounced, obviously, as well. So it is certainly having a disproportionate impact on those particular communities. I don't have numbers to quantify to what extent that's been a constraint on the labor market.
And obviously housing is a huge challenge. I mean, we have the data to show just, I mean, we have Maine's median house price right now is the highest it's ever been. People are being priced out of both the home buying market and also finding, affordable rental properties in the state. It's incredibly expensive. I check the real estate listings here in Biddeford every single day. There's currently a house just under $600,000 near me on the market, and a house at $500,000 on the market. I mean, in downtown Biddeford or close to downtown Biddeford, having homes on the market for that kind of price is, I mean, it would have been unheard of even 2 or 3 years ago. And these houses will sell, and they'll probably sell to folks from out of state. We've seen Maine was 5th in the nation for in-migration last year. A lot of folks moving from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, and California, and coming to Maine and buying up property and also moving into rental units. And they have really driven the cost up for Maine people. I think of Biddeford as the perfect, or a great case study, not great in the sense that it's happening, but great in the sense that it really reflects what happens when a community has significant improvements. Our downtown has clearly experienced a renaissance of sorts, and it's become an attractive place to live. But the people who stuck it out through those tough times, I mean, when the mills closed, our economic engine of our downtown, the reason why we exist as a community, people stuck it out. I mean, they stayed here a long time. Biddeford folks, really, they rode out those tough times, and now that we've started to improve, they're not able to afford to live here anymore, and they're looking elsewhere, which moves them further away from their employers, further away from employment opportunities, because we obviously know a lot of employment opportunities exist in urban centers like Biddeford and Portland, and across southern Maine, for example, and of course as you move up the state, Augusta and Bangor and Waterville and so forth, and people are being priced out of those areas, and they're moving further and further away from their workplaces, and that's obviously constraining. So when we talk about why employers can't find workers, housing is clearly a huge piece of this puzzle, and we have way more work to do in the legislature to solve this. I'm excited about the Build Back Better plan yet again, because there's a huge investment in the construction of affordable housing in that plan, and I hope that it will pass so that we can take advantage of it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that probably concludes what we have for right now. So I think if folks want to reach out or think of any other questions, obviously they can reach out to me or to any of my colleagues at MISEP. I think I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Suzy Young, Ryan Fecteau, Dave Cooper. I think you guys have all been really helpful, and I want to thank those of you who are attending for coming along and asking questions. And again, if there's anything more, please certainly feel free to reach out to any of us by email or through any other means, and we'll be happy to answer more questions. So thank you all. Oh, and there will be a recording of this made available and sent out as well for folks who might want to access that. So we will send you details of that too. Okay, thanks everyone.